Jesus said to his disciples, "In those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens." From the free fig tree, learn this lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that hour, that day, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. The Gospel of the Lord. I remember trying out an experiment with a group of youth. I took a white sheet of paper, and on that blank white sheet of paper, I drew a circle. And in the circle, at random, I just put in a few black dots, 5 or 6 of them. And then I held up this white sheet of paper to the group, and I asked them, I said, "What do you see in the circle?" And immediately, with one voice, most of them answered, "Black dots." And then I asked one of them, I said, "Can you come forward, take a closer look and tell me, what do you see in the circle?" So one of them came forward, looked closely at the circle, and he told me, "Black dots. Some are darker than the others, and they are set in a pattern. But it's black dots that I see." And it is then I asked them a question. I asked them, I said, "Did you not see the white spaces between the black dots?" The white spaces were more evident, but to most or all of the group, it was the black dots that they noticed, not the white spaces. Now, the gospel of today speaks to us about the last days. And the gospel is addressed to us in apocalyptic language and symbols that I must say most of us do not understand, particularly in our day and in our time. But interestingly, while reading the gospel for you, I'm sure what stood out in the gospel passage most were the black spots. What is it attracted us to listen? It was mainly the focus on violence, on death, on destruction that will ensue prior to the end of the world. We did not or may not have seen the white spaces of hope that the gospel of today inspires in those who believe. Brethren, in the month of November, the Christian community is confronted with the reality of death, a passing or the snuffing out of life, a physical death that has taken our loved ones. But more importantly, the church keeps this month and helps us to remember that for every one of us, death is inevitable. Death is inevitable. Now, the very thought of death creates within most of us a traumatic fear. And what is this fear? That all of us live in a world of our own, that the bubble of our little world that we have created around us will one day burst, and life in this world is snuffed out. And yet, if we stop for a moment and look at life itself as we live in this world, that our life is a pilgrimage, that our whole life in this world is a pilgrimage from the womb to the tomb. It is a series of deaths and change that takes place in our life. For from one dimension of life, we move into another dimension. Our pilgrimage from the womb to the tomb is dying to the previous stage of life, emerging into a new and a fuller life, or a more mature life. We don't seem to understand, if we take an example, a simple example, we don't seem to understand how is it possible to die in our lifetime. For we die from one dimension, as we enter and emerge into the next, death takes place, new life begins. For instance, a child conceived in the womb. A child conceived in the womb grows up in the comfort and the security of its mother's womb. But there will and must be a time when that child emerges into another stage of life, and we call that the trauma of being born. The trauma of being born. But birth is inevitable. It is a must for this fetus in the womb, or it will pose a threat to itself and a threat to its mother. Now, after birth, the little child is still vulnerable, but it is prepared for further being exposed and facing life in the world. With the very first steps it takes, it begins its journey away, or rather it cuts the umbilical cord and begins its journey or distances itself from its mother. Childhood, and getting out of this dimension of childhood is also a must. It is inevitable. So from childhood to the stage of becoming a teenager, an adolescent, an adult, each stage means dying to the previous so that I emerge into yet another stage of life. But this does not affect us as much as it does when we come face to face with physical death, when this life will be snuffed out. The life in this world will be snuffed out. Moving from one stage of life into the next carries with it its own fears, its own confusions, because every stage involves death from one dimension of life, one dimension of this life, to the next dimension, emerging to a new and the fuller life. But when it comes to death, we don't think in terms of another stage of life. Death itself is actually moving from this stage of life into yet another stage of life. In the preface of The Dead, which I will read for you today, The preface reminds us that death is not the end. Life is not ended, it is changed at the point of death. So also physical death is not the end, but it is the beginning of a new stage of life, a new stage of life with God. Life is changed, not ended. Although physical death is inevitable, the question I put to all of us is, why do most of us have a traumatic fear of death? It lurks not so much on the conscious levels, but in our sub and unconscious levels. It lurks in those dark areas and emerges very often in our life that the very thought of death is traumatic. Why then? Why then is death so traumatic to many of us? Although physical death is inevitable, yet the very thought, the reason why death is frightening is the very thought of delinking ourselves from all that we have accumulated during our lifetime, our families, our friends, our egos, our context that we have so meticulously cultivated, our achievements of the past, our plans, our dreams for the future, our fortune, have taken a high toll and a long time to achieve during this lifetime in the world. Now, to let go of all this is traumatic, is frightening. Brethren, on the threshold of death, we see a signboard that reads, "Beyond this point, no baggage. You take nothing with you, not even the life that you have cherished and sustained on this earth, not even your life. Everything has to be abandoned." That is what we will find in the signboard on the threshold of death. The question, or the perennial question that we ask of ourselves is, how then? How then can we live knowing that suffering will dog our every step in life's journey, and eventually death will creep up upon us? Is there an answer to suffering and death? And it is here, as I said, we look at the black spots in the reading of today, but maybe we've overlooked what Jesus tells us. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And what is the word that gives us hope in times of our upheavals or sufferings? What is the word that gives us the hope and the promise of a changed life after our death? And it is this Jesus very clearly enunciates, saying, "He who lives, he who believes in me, even though he die, yet shall he live. For I am the resurrection and the life." Do you, who dare to stand up and say Sunday after Sunday, "I believe in Jesus Christ"? Do you believe the word of promise that he makes to us in the gospel? "He who lives and believes in me, even though he die, yet shall he live. For I am the resurrection and the life." I end this little reflection today with the words taken from a mortuary card that beautifully brings home to us that death is not the end. Life is not ended, it is changed. And the words read this way: death is not extinguishing the light, it is rather putting out the lamp because the dawn is approaching. We enter into another dimension of life. Death is not the end. Life is changed.